U.S. President Biden's goal was ambitious. By July 4th, have 70% of U.S. adults vaccinated against the coronavirus with at least one shot and be on the way out of the pandemic. Well, the U.S. has finally reached that mark 1 month later than planned, and one Delta variant that wasn't planned. The coronavirus is once again spreading like wildfire in the U.S. There are similar situations in China, across Africa, and here in Europe. We know that the vaccines are protecting us, especially the elderly. The virus needs new hosts, and it's finding them in our children. I'm Brent Goff in Berlin. This is The Day.
Today was probably one of the most emotionally hard days since the pandemic started.
We know how to beat this. We know how to get in front of this to slow down the spread.
The Delta wave that we're seeing now, people are younger and sicker.
Go out today, get the vaccine.
And we're intubating and losing people that are my age and younger.
Also coming up tomorrow, August 4th, will mark 1 year since that massive explosion in the port of Beirut. Around 200 people died. Days later, the entire Lebanese government resigned in a political implosion. But it wasn't the end of Lebanon's nightmare.
It's just because we thought after the blast, we all thought that, okay, now this ruling class, like there's no way they're gonna last, right? It's impossible after something like this. It was literally their incompetence, their negligence, their corruption that blew up the city. And here we are, like 1 year later, and nothing's changed. And it's just absurd. It's like there's no logic to anything.
To our viewers on PBS in the United States and to all of you around the world, welcome. We begin the day with the pandemic pain that many thought had gone away. In the past 2 months, from China to the U.S. to here in Europe, we have seen the numbers of vaccinated people swell, but not enough. And we have witnessed how the Delta variant has upended any and every prediction about how the pandemic would end. Many had hoped that the summer of 2021 would mark the return to some sense of normality. The Delta variant has dashed those hopes. Today, China announced that it will test all 11 million people in the city of Wuhan for COVID-19. Wuhan, you may remember, was the very first epicenter of this pandemic. And in the United States, the number of new infections and hospitalizations, they're rising again. Almost all of those who get sick are unvaccinated. In fact, almost 100 million Americans have still not gotten their first shot, many by choice, but not the children. There is no approved vaccine for kids under the age of 12. It is precisely this group that is being hit by the Delta variant. The state of Florida leads the United States in children hospitalized with COVID-19.
I can say today was probably one of the most emotionally hard days since the pandemic started. The Delta wave that we're seeing now, people are younger and sicker, and we are intubating and losing people that are my age and younger. And so many of the people that we're getting haven't been vaccinated. And just to know that there's something that could help, and people aren't taking advantage of it. I can't explain the feeling of defeat when you do everything, you pour everything into a patient and it's not enough. And then to know that they could have gotten vaccinated and it could have made a difference.
Well, joining me now is Dr. Peter Chin-Hong. He's an infectious disease specialist at the University of California in San Francisco. It's good to have you back on the program, Doctor. I mean, you just heard that nurse there, the despair and the frustration in her voice as more and more children are being hospitalized with COVID-19. Did it have to come to this?
It definitely didn't have to come to this, Brent. I think we're celebrating 70% at least one shot in the US, but do realize, and I'm sure the audience knows, that you need really both shots of a two-shot series to really have any semblance of a battle against Delta. We know that 30% protection after one shot, but really you're getting higher levels after two shots, which is needed. So a lot of frustration, millions of people not vaccinated, a lot of vulnerable noses and mouths for Delta to exploit.
I mean, I'm wondering, are we witnessing the perfect storm here? The school year is about to begin in the U.S. Children under 12 are not vaccinated, and the Delta variant is spreading. And as you say, it needs new hosts. Is this pandemic, is it becoming more and more a story of kids getting sick?
You know, I'm keeping an open mind, Brent, but, you know, from pre-Delta days, we do know that kids under 12 are less likely to get and transmit COVID. So far, our focus has been on building that wall around kids, you know, vaccinating as many adults as possible. Even in the biggest surges in the US in the past year, most of the kids did get it from the community. We had an outbreak recently in California. And again, that was at the beginning of the school year. And again, most of that was from community spread. So if you vaccinate the adults, which really comes down to that equation, we're still not even there yet. I think we have a better benefit of protecting our kids.
Children's hospitalizations due to COVID-19 in the United States are highest in the state of Florida. The governor of Florida has also prohibited schools from requiring face masks to be worn there. As a physician, let me ask you, what do these two facts tell you?
It just tells me that you're opening the door for further infection. You're, you know, again, not allowing people to give that go into the toolbox for a prevention mitigation strategy. It's very similar to what Florida did with cruise ships. Again, having this very blindsided way of dealing with a pandemic that really is looking to exploit any fractures. So I think it goes in line with how Florida has approached the pandemic, which is, again, out of concert to what we know scientifically.
There is a lot of attention at the moment on possible booster shots, especially for the elderly and the immune-compromised people. Should our focus be just as strong on getting a vaccine approved and then into the arms of children?
Yes, I mean, we're hoping that Pfizer will be out first with data for kids under 12, but that's slated to be at the end of September, early October at the earliest. Moderna will follow. But yes, I mean, I think, you know, we probably do need that time for the data. The FDA did request that Pfizer double the size of their trial to look for more safety signals, but it shouldn't, you know, prevent the early data that will be done there. But you're right, Brent. I think that, you know, we need as many people immunized as possible, not just the adults. And I think as COVID goes lower in the age groups, we need to protect as many people as possible.
You and I spoke last year at the beginning of December, and then you were worried about the surge after surge of new infections, you know, from Thanksgiving to Christmas to New Year's. Now we've got summer soon ending. We have children returning to classrooms. We have more and more adults returning to work. It feels like this is a little bit like deja vu, is it?
It's deja vu with one difference. The one difference is that the most vulnerable folks, those over 65 and those in nursing homes, have been well immunized even across the country, 85% in many places. So right now we're still not seeing close to the number of deaths and severe disease in ICUs in the country in general, as we've seen last year. Of course, there are pockets, Louisiana, Missouri, Florida, Arkansas, which look very much, if not worse than last year. But it all boils down to a simple equation. How much of that community is actually vaccinated? And it mirrors how much the hospital system is being strained. So if you ask me, it looks similar in some respects, but there are two Americas now. Those of the unvaccinated and those are the vaccinated.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is the case at the moment. Dr. Peter Chin-Hong joining us tonight from San Francisco. As always, Doctor, it's good to talk with you. We appreciate your time and your insights. Stay healthy.
Thanks so much, Brent.
A Belarusian activist has been found dead in neighboring Ukraine a day after he was reported missing. Police say Vitaly Shishov was found hanged in a park near his home in the capital, Kiev, early on Tuesday. Shishov led an organization that helps Belarusians fleeing persecution. Ukrainian police have launched a murder inquiry. Earlier, we spoke to our correspondent in Kiev, Nick Connolly, and we asked him what the Ukrainian police are saying about the discovery of Vitaly Shishov's body.
He went missing about 9 o'clock yesterday morning out for his run and never came back. He was found about 24 hours later this morning in a stretch of forest just outside Kiev, near where he lived. He was found hanged in a tree. They talked also of the wounds. He was found to have some grazing on his knees, on his nose, some kind of suggestion there that perhaps those wounds weren't quite compatible with having hanged himself. Speculation that maybe he was brought to fall, pushed to the ground before that happened. That's obviously the one line of inquiry, that this was a murder made to look like suicide, but the suicide option is still on the table and being investigated. His girlfriend certainly says she can see no reason for him to commit suicide, hadn't seen anything unusual in his behavior, but had said that he had felt increasingly tense in recent weeks and had tip-offs from contacts both in Belarus and here in Ukraine that his security was under threat.
DW's Nick Connolly reporting there from Kiev. Now to the second story with connections to Belarus. Belarusian athlete Kristina Timanovskaya says that her actions were not politically motivated when she sought refuge at the Polish embassy in Tokyo earlier this week. In her first public statement since entering the embassy, the Olympic sprinter said that she feared she would face punishment if she returned to her home country. The case has become the biggest political showdown of this year's Olympics, and the International Olympic Committee, it's launched a formal investigation.
Security has been tightened outside of the Polish embassy in Tokyo. Inside, Kristina Timanovskaya says her attempted deportation by Belarusian authorities left her little choice but to seek asylum. They made it clear that I would be punished when I returned to Belarus. They also said that if I tried to stay and run the 200-meter, that they would fire me from the team. And they also implied that that wouldn't be the end of the story. Timanovskaya had been the target of a media backlash in her homeland after she criticized the decision by team management to enter her in a different event at short notice. She was also one of 2,000 athletes to sign a letter calling for the release of Belarusian opposition figures, caught up in President Alexander Lukashenko's recent crackdown on pro-democracy protesters. With her Olympic dreams dashed for now, the runner says her priority is getting to Europe. Right now I want to get to Europe safely. I want to meet with people there that can help me and decide together what my next step should be. Timanovskaya is expected to remain in the Polish embassy until she flies to Warsaw later this week.
And for more now, I'm joined by Heather McGill. She is a researcher in the Eastern Europe and Central Asia office at Amnesty International. It's good to have you on the program. Let me ask you about this athlete. She was one of hundreds of sports figures in Belarus who signed an open letter calling for new elections and for political prisoners in the country to be freed. Is then what we're seeing right now, is this a case of President Lukashenko getting revenge?
Certainly, when athletes speak out, it is particularly hurtful to President Lukashenko. He's very fond of sport. He was personally heading the National Olympic Committee until December, when he was removed from that position. So, yes, I think that there are particular efforts put into stopping athletes from speaking out.
And the chairman of Belarus's National Olympic Committee is now the son of President Lukashenko. And certainly, Kristina Tismanowskaya, she must have known what could happen when she publicly criticized the National Committee and her coaches, right? I mean, didn't she know what she was getting herself into?
Well, I'm sure she probably knew there was a risk, but she obviously felt very strongly that she wasn't, she shouldn't compete in an event that she was unprepared for. But I mean, it was a personal dilemma for her. It's a personal tragedy for her. She's giving up her career in Belarus. She's leaving her family behind, and that was obviously a big consideration. We don't know what threats she heard from these people, but it basically is typical of the total lack of respect for human rights, the inhumanity of the authorities in Belarus, and a total disregard for the right to freedom of expression. So she spoke out, she's suffering the repercussions, but thousands of people in Belarus who have spoken out, who have taken part in demonstrations, have suffered reprisals, have been imprisoned, have suffered torture and other ill treatment. And so the authorities seek to completely eradicate any form of dissent, any form of alternative views.
I might ask you, maybe if you could try to look into the mind of President Lukashenko here. Why is he targeting Belarusian athletes? What can he hope to gain from this? Because she gave an interview to a journalist for, I think it was a Belarusian radio station. And it wouldn't have been a story, an international story, if it had just stayed there. But then when she was taken to the airport, forced against her will, that's when it became a big story. So why do you think this regime would push something so far when it doesn't have to?
I think they feel that they have to stop any form of dissent, any form of criticism. And I think it's become a kind of knee-jerk reaction that anybody who criticizes is suspected of disloyalty. And that's what she's been accused of in the press in Belarus. So anybody speaking out, and the regime just seeks to make everybody stay silent. And it is the very brave people who do speak out. And when I was interviewing athletes for the briefing that we published yesterday, I'm amazed at the bravery of people who, despite the difficulties, despite knowing what the costs are, choose to speak out because their conscience just doesn't allow them to remain silent. And athletes in particular have faced reprisals because they have been the darlings of the government in Belarus. And 95 athletes, for instance, have been detained for taking part in peaceful protests. And 124 have suffered other forms of reprisals, such as being dropped from the national team, being fired from their jobs, being threatened, being intimidated. And this is very serious in Belarus because in a country where everything is controlled by the government, if you are deprived of state support, there is nothing else for you. You have no other means of training. And one of the athletes I spoke to was Andrei Kravchenko, who is a decathlon athlete. And he described how the deputy minister of sport actually came to his door, and he was standing at his door with his child in his arms, and the deputy minister of sport threatened him and demanded that he should stop speaking out.
Unbelievable. Yeah, and to do that too with a child in his arms. Heather McGill from Amnesty International. Ms. McGill, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
It has been nearly 1 year since that massive explosion ripped through the Lebanese capital, Beirut, killing nearly 200 people. Around 6,000 people were injured, and large parts of the city, as you just saw, were destroyed. You're looking now at drone shots of the blast site. 1 year on, the port of Beirut and its surrounding neighborhoods are still a wasteland. 77,000 homes were either destroyed or badly damaged and have not been rebuilt. The country is on its knees economically and without a functioning government. And that has hampered the rebuilding efforts. We know what caused the blast, tons of highly explosive ammonium nitrate, which were illegally stored in a warehouse. The explosives should have never been there to begin with, and yet no one has been arrested or charged in connection with the disaster.
It was one of the biggest non-nuclear explosions in history. Lebanon went through civil war in the 1970s and 80s, but Beirut had never seen anything on this scale. The city's port was obliterated. Satellite images show the area before and after the blast. But the devastation stretched far wider than that. Entire neighbourhoods were reduced to ruins in an instant. In addition to the many dead and injured, 300,000 people were displaced from their homes. It soon emerged that large amounts of highly explosive ammonium nitrate had been improperly stored at the port for years, a disaster waiting to happen. The shock soon turned to anger. Lebanon had already experienced months of protest over rampant inflation, with many blaming the political elite for economic mismanagement and corruption. Now, some protesters began storming government ministries. Less than a week after the blast, the government resigned. But 1 year on, Prime Minister Hassan Diab is still in office in a caretaker capacity because no one has managed to form a new government. Najib Mikati is the latest candidate to try. But whoever takes over the reins will face a formidable task. The coronavirus pandemic has overwhelmed the country's hospitals. Basic medications are in short supply. Lebanon is one of the most indebted countries in the world, and half the population is now living in poverty. An energy crisis has exacerbated the problems, with long queues forming for even a small amount of fuel. Last month, Lebanon's caretaker Prime Minister issued a dramatic cry for help. I call on the United Nations and all international agencies to help save the Lebanese people from dying and prevent the demise of this country. Lebanon is days away from social explosion. Meanwhile, the families of those who died in the blast continue to demand answers. They want those responsible for the loss of their loved ones to be held to account in a court of law.
For more now, I'm joined by our correspondent, Rebecca Ritter. She is in Beirut. Good evening to you, Rebecca. You know, the whole world wants to know, how is it possible that 1 year after this blast, not a single person has been held responsible? How is that possible?
Well, as you say, everybody wants to know the answer to that question, not least of all the victims' families, rather. I mean, I've spoken to some of the people who lost people that day, some of the families of people who lost people that day, and they are furious. They're really angry. We're expecting to see a lot of people out in the streets tomorrow demanding answers from the government. Basically, the simple answer really is that those in charge have nothing to gain and everything to lose from the truth coming out. I mean, the people who run Lebanon have been the same people who've been running this country since the end of the Civil War, and they were the same people who were in fact fighting each other in the Civil War. Then they divvied up the political portfolio so that they could personally profit. They've been harbouring under a political immunity that has seen assassinations and other corruption charges go uninvestigated. So that's very little different to what's happening here with this blast. And there's a sense that once the thread is pulled, the whole house of cards will come down, which is certainly not what they want.
Yeah, Rebecca, you're there on the ground. You know that little has changed in the past year. How difficult has it been for the families of the victims and for the people whose entire neighborhoods were destroyed?
Well, there's hardly a person in this city or this country, Brent, that doesn't have a story about how they were affected by the blast, but in particular the people who lost their houses, their livelihoods, all those that were injured, of which 800 or more than 800 are now permanently disabled. And of course, as you mentioned, the families of the victims' life has been a nightmare. There is a collective trauma here in Lebanon, not only because of the blast, but because of that lack of justice that we just discussed. That 1 year on, still nothing has been done.
All right, our correspondent Rebecca Ritters. They are on the ground in Beirut on the eve of the 1-year anniversary of that blast in the port of Beirut. Rebecca, thank you. Well, the day is almost done. The conversation, it continues online. You will find us on Twitter, either at DW News, or you can follow me at Brent Goff TV. And remember, whatever happens between now and then, tomorrow is another day. We'll see you then.